minimum benefits for the American people so that they could enjoy the security of health insurance coverage, quality health insurance coverage. But for people who were on a plan when the Affordable Care Act was signed into law and who want to keep that plan and they've stayed on that plan,
White House spokesman Jay Carney will leave it here and return to live coverage of the U.S. Senate.
That does not meet the standard.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin. I'm not sorry. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman,
I'm coming about you with Gary Hornish. In fairness, he asked us that.
Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, and Wicker. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. White House.
White House, no. Now you got to be on really best behavior now.
Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Rono. Mr. Moran, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Klobuchar, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Reed of Rhode Island, Schatz, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Colorado, Warren, and White House. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Rockefeller, no.
Thank you. Thanks for suggesting.
Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Beckidge, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Nelson? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Heller? Aye.
Ask if anyone would. Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 45, the nays are 54, and the motion to proceed is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be General Counsel.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the nomination. Who yields time? The senator from Iowa.
Madam President, we're getting ready to vote to end debate. This is a cloture vote on the nomination of Richard Griffin to serve as General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. As I stated yesterday, this is an important role for making sure the NLRB can do its job.
The Senate will be in order. Senators, please take their conversations out of the well. The senator from Iowa.
Thank you, Madam President. This summer, as you know, we voted to fill the board with the requisite number of Republicans and Democrats on the board. I thought that was a good vote. This is the one left over. That's the General Counsel position. Mr. Griffin is very well qualified. He's been thoroughly vetted. I have received absolutely not one objection to his qualifications or his background. He's had 30 years' experience as a lawyer, a labor lawyer, and he deserves strong bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues to vote cloture so we can get to the vote later today.
Madam President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I am not going to vote to confirm Mr. Griffin because I think his membership on the board doesn't do anything to keep it from moving toward advocacy instead of being an umpire. But I do think it's time to close the debate and have an up and down vote, so I'm going to vote yes on cloture.
Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Ayotte.
Hey, John, how are you?
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. No. Got an email to give you about that time. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Blake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Heller, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Vitter. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Hatch, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Graham, no. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 62, the nays are 37. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to. Pursuant to Senate Resolution 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be 8 hours of debate on the nomination, equally divided in the usual form. The Republican whip.
Mr. President, in the aftermath of the battles over the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling, I'm sure I'm not alone in hearing from my constituents who are hoping that Democrats and Republicans can work together on some of the most important and chronic problems that challenge our country. Instead of taking that advice or taking that opportunity, my friends across the aisle have taken this opportunity to engage in what can only be described as a power grab that will result in even more polarization and partisan acrimony here in Washington. What I'm talking about specifically is the President's and the Democratic leadership's effort to pack the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. For those who may not follow the federal court system, America has 13 different federal appellate courts, but the D.C. court stands out as the most powerful in the country. Some have called it the second most important court in the nation because it has jurisdiction over a variety of regulatory and constitutional matters, whether they relate to Dodd-Frank and financial services, whether they relate to Obamacare and its implementation, or whether they relate to national security matters. All of those types of cases get heard in the D.C. Circuit Court. No other appellate court in the nation wields such vast influence over hot-button issues, ranging, as I said, from health care to environmental issues. The Environmental Protection Agency and its activities, which I know are important to the presiding officer, as they are to me, as well as gun rights and the war on terrorism. Now, President Obama argues that the D.C. Circuit Court needs 3 more judges in order to get its work done. But the facts simply don't bear that out. That's not true. For example, between 2005 and 2013, the D.C. Circuit's total number of written decisions per active judge actually went down by 27%. The number of appeals filed with the court fell by 18%. So instead of having more work to do, it has less work to do than it did in 2005. As one commentator has observed, the D.C. Circuit already has the lowest caseload in the nation. And if anything, trends show that their workload is decreasing. Decreasing, going down, not up. Indeed, one D.C. Circuit Court judge recently told the senior senator from Iowa that if any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around. Well, you might be wondering then why the President and why Senator Reid want to pack the D.C. Circuit Court with 3 additional judges if there's not enough work to go around today. Well, I would just note, Mr. President, that the D.C. Circuit Court also has a unique record in that it actually took 4 months off between May and September of this year. Hardly the record of a court that has too much work to do and simply can't get it done. Meanwhile, there are courts across our country, both appellate courts and district courts, that are overburdened, some of which are labeled as a judicial emergency, because they simply have such a heavy caseload they can't get it done. Why wouldn't we want to allocate more judicial resources, more help to those courts that need the help, rather than to pack the D.C. Circuit Court with judges it simply doesn't need? Well, don't just take my word for it. Prominent Democratic leaders have actually made no secret of what's happening here, because you would wonder what the rationale is if there's not enough work to do. Why, as Senator Reid and other Democratic leaders, why would they want to add new judges to a court that doesn't have enough work to do? Well, back in March, the senior senator from New York, Senator Schumer, said of the D.C. Circuit judges, the second half here, he said, here's what they have done in the last year. They've overturned the EPA's ability to regulate existing coal plants. They've rendered the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, impotent by saying that the SEC can't pass rulings unless they do what is called a cost-benefit analysis. And they've ruled that recess appointments couldn't be taken into account. Here's what Senator Schumer said: we will fill up the D.C. Circuit one way or another. Well, I disagree with Senator Schumer's characterization on some of these cases, but it is true that the D.C. Circuit Court has a unique role in American jurisprudence in deciding some very important cases for the entire country, because the administrative agencies that are part of the executive branch, when they make decisions, whether it's financial services, the Environmental Protection Agency, whether it's Health and Human Services, whether it's any administrative agency, those decisions typically get decided and reviewed by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. More recently, the Majority Leader put it this way. This is the top quote. He says, we're focusing very intently on the D.C. Circuit. We need at least one more. There are 3 vacancies. We need at least one more, and that will switch the majority. So this isn't about the efficient administration of justice, impartial justice. This is about stacking the court by changing the majority. That's the Majority Leader of the United States Senate who said that. So there's no mystery about what's going on here. The Majority Leader and his allies are attempting to pack the court with judges who will rubber stamp their big government agenda. And he's also threatening to use the nuclear option, again, unless Senate Republicans simply snap to attention and salute smartly. Well, it's not going to happen. In simple terms, Democrats are prepared to violate the Senate's own rules to help flip the D.C. Circuit in favor of the Obama administration's aggressive administrative overreach. If these tactics succeed, the Senate will be weakened as an institution, and the nation's second highest court will be transformed into a far-left ideological body. But I would also remind my colleagues what goes around comes around in the United States Senate. When Republicans control the Senate and we have a Republican in the White House, I would warn my colleagues that the same rules that they put into effect with the nuclear option will be used to their disadvantage then. And we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't go there. But it's clear what the motivation is. Again, this is not about the efficient administration of justice, impartial justice. This is about getting your way and getting a rubber stamp on the actions of regulatory overreach that are far too common here in Washington, D.C. Well, it is true that the D.C. Circuit Court has ruled against the Obama administration's regulatory agencies, but it's also true that they've affirmed many of the most important and far-reaching decisions of the Obama administration's regulatory agencies. One example where it ruled against the administration is in 2011, when it struck down the Securities and Exchange Commission proxy access rule by declaring that the agency failed to conduct a cost-benefit analysis required by law before adopting the regulation. Now, I don't know about you, but I wish the government would do more cost-benefit analyses, not less. And I'm glad the D.C. Circuit Court struck down the failure of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the failure to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, which they did. In another example, last year the court vacated the Environmental Protection Agency's cross-state air pollution rule, noting it would impose massive emissions reduction requirements on certain states without regard to the limits set by the statutory text. In other words, they acted beyond their congressional authorization. This was also an example in Texas. Texas got swept into this cross-state air pollution rule without even an opportunity to be heard and to offer competing analysis of the models that the Environmental Protection Agency used. So no matter how committed we all are to clean air, we shouldn't sanction an administrative agency run amok doing things that aren't authorized by the statutory text. Well, the D.C. Circuit has also rejected an unconstitutional pair of appointments by the President made to the National Labor Relations Board. Talk about overreach. This is where the President tried to trump the confirmation powers of the United States Senate in the Constitution, the power of advise and consent, which it's called, by making unconstitutional so-called recess appointments. And the D.C. Circuit called him on it and held it was unconstitutional. More recently, the court held that the President's Nuclear Regulatory Commission was simply flouting the law. Now, don't we want a court to call the President when administrative agencies are simply flouting the law? If we are a nation of laws, in this case, they flouted the law by delaying a decision on whether to use the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. Now, these were all common sense decisions, and you could probably tell from my comments that I think they were well grounded in the law and the facts, and I agree with the decision. But in that case, they all went against the Obama administration's preferred position. But it's true the D.C. Circuit has also ruled in favor of the administration's position in a number of cases. Again, here's an EPA decision. Since 2012, Jeremy Jacobs reports that the agency has won 60% of the cases that have been reviewed by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. 60% of the lawsuits where the Environmental Protection Agency has been taken to court for exceeding its authority, 60% of the time the EPA position has prevailed. That's a better performance than the EPA had at the circuit during George W. Bush's administration. In particular, the EPA has scored landmark victories on cases relating to greenhouse gas regulations, ethanol-blended gasoline, and mountaintop removal coal mining. But beyond energy and environmental issues, the D.C. Circuit Court has upheld President Obama's executive order regarding embryonic stem cell research on two separate occasions, in 2011 and 2012. Again, these aren't my preferred outcomes, but I think it demonstrates that the D.C. Circuit Court has learned to strike a balance and certainly is not pro-administration or anti-administration. It epitomizes what a court should be, which is an impartial administrator of justice. Again, this same court upheld the Affordable Care Act in 2011, ruling that the individual health insurance mandate was constitutional under the Commerce Clause. Well, we know what happened when it got to the United States Supreme Court. They had a different view. But it demonstrates the kind of judicial restraint that the current D.C. Court, balanced as it is, with 4 nominees by a Republican president and 4 nominees by a Democratic president, how it is administered even-handed justice, which would be destroyed if the president is successful and Senator Reid successful in packing this court with 3 more of its liberal allies. Well, As I say, this court is currently split right down the middle. 4 of the active judges are appointed by a Republican president. 4 were appointed by a Democratic president. And yet it's clear that the D.C. Circuit Court is in the crosshairs of the majority leader and his Democratic allies, including the president, because they want to tilt the court in their direction, a more liberal, a bigger government direction, one that's more deferential to administrative agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies that refuse to take into account a cost-benefit analysis, which we ought to have more of, not less. Well, the truth is there is an answer to this standoff in terms of the court packing that President Obama and Senator Reid are attempting here. There actually is a way to reallocate these unneeded seats from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals to other courts that actually need the judges, unlike this court that has the lightest caseload of any circuit court in the nation. Senator Grassley, the senior senator from Iowa, has offered a reasonable compromise which would allow several of President Obama's appellate nominees to be approved for district courts or courts of appeals where they're actually needed. In other words, President Obama would still get to pick them. He'd just have to pick them for courts where they actually have enough work to do and where they're needed. Again, based on current caseloads, the D.C. Circuit Court does not need new judges, but other appellate courts really do. I would think during a time when budgets are constrained, after the Budget Control Act, when discretionary spending is down, when the courts need more resources allocated, that we would want to allocate the resources to courts and to jurisdictions where they're actually needed, not to places where they're not needed. For all these reasons and more, I hope that members of both parties will agree that the reasonable things to do would be to pass the Grassley bill, the Grassley compromise, to reallocate these judges to the places where they're really needed and to prevent the stacking of this court and this reckless power grab. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in recognition